This is the Rise of the East podcast. I am your host, Joel Francis, and this is episode 10, Mithridates the Great. And I've decided to start the episode off with some quotes. The first one by Thomas B. Macaulay. Quote, "We hardly know an instance of the strength and weakness of human nature so striking and so grotesque as the character of this haughty, vigilant, resolute, sagacious, blue-stocking, half Mithridates and half Trissotin, bearing up against a world in arms, with an ounce of poison in one pocket and a quire of bad verses in the other." End quote. Another one by Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham. Quote, "How few successful men are interesting. Hannibal, Alcibiades with Raleigh, Mithridates and Napoleon. Who would compare them for a moment with their mere conquerors?" End quote. And the next one by Apian. Quote, "Many times he had over 400 ships of his own, 50,000 cavalry, and 250,000 infantry, with engines and arms in proportion. For allies, he had the king of Armenia and the princes of the Scythian tribes around the Euxine and the Sea of Azov and beyond, as far as the Thracian Bosphorus. He held communications with the leaders of the Roman civil wars, which were then fiercely raging, and with those who were inciting insurrections in Spain. He established friendly relations with the Gauls for the purpose of invading Italy. From Cilicia to the Pillars of Heracles he filled the sea with pirates, who stopped all commerce and navigation between cities and caused severe famine for a long time. In short, he left nothing within the power of man undone or untried to start the greatest possible movement, extending from the Orient to the Occident, to vex, so to speak, the whole world which was warred upon, tangled in alliances, harassed by pirates, or vexed by the neighborhood of the warfare. Such and so diverse was this one war, but in the end it brought the greatest gains to the Romans, for it pushed the boundaries of their domain from the setting of the sun to the river Euphrates. It has been impossible to distinguish all these exploits by nations, since they were performed at the same time and were complicated with each other, those which could be separated." End quote. 2 decades after his death, Cicero called Mithridates, quote, "the greatest king since Alexander the Great," end quote, a compliment that would have thrilled Mithridates to hear. Pliny praised him as, quote, "the greatest king of his era," end quote. As we can see, Mithridates was basically heroized, practically like a Superman. But in reality, Mithridates the Great was like every other Hellenistic king, like Philip of Macedon or Antiochus the Great. The Mithridatic Wars are almost like a rematch for the East and West. What do I mean about that? Well, the Persian Empire and the Macedonian Empire declared war on each other, one fighting to keep the other out of its territory, and the other trying to take the other's territory. We know in the end that Macedon won. But if you compare the two, both were large-scale wars. They included the deaths of hundreds of thousands, great losses and victories. Both wars contained military geniuses, and we definitely know that Mithridates thought of himself as a second Alexander. But the West has called Mithridates a mass murderer who's never paid properly for the deaths of 100,000 Italians. But who really was Mithridates the Great? Was he a terrorist or was he a savior? Now, we alone cannot answer that question. We obviously were not there. However, when we read about the Mithridatic Wars, we see a Pontic warlord fighting for his kingdom's freedom and his life. Of course, you can take that view however you want. I do not think Mithridates was a terrorist, nor do I think he was a savior king. He was like every other king, opportunistic, ambitious, and a freedom fighter. Mithridates knew that Rome would never allow him to grow his kingdom to its fullest extent. He had to declare war on them. So as I have stated in one of my other episodes, Mithridates either surrendered or fought. Now, what was Rome's reaction? A few months after Mithridates' death, javelins flew into Pompey's camp. They were saying that Mithridates had died. As if they had won a magnificent battle, Pompey and his men celebrated. They performed sacrifices. Pompey sent a letter back to the Senate, and Cicero declared 10 days of thanksgiving. There was a problem, though. Did Mithridates really die? When Pompey went to Pontus, he ordered the body to be brought to him. When he saw it, he looked away. He couldn't bear to look at the face, and the body was unrecognizable. The problem is that knowing Mithridates, he probably didn't die. Why am I saying this? Well, all of the scars that Mithridates had would have been gone, except for one, the scar on his leg. However, any cavalry member could have had that same exact wound, and if we follow Cassius Dio's report, Pharnaces would have stabbed him to death and mutilated the body. One thing would have the Roman Senate cursing Mithridates again was that he still had not been beaten. Whether he escaped or died, Rome would never see Mithridates in change. Another question is what happened to the body? Almost like in Alexander the Great's situation, the body was gone. It wasn't buried at Emacia. What is thought is that there was another castle near Sinope, where Mithridates was buried, and then the castle was destroyed. Another question was what happened to Hypsicratia? She was an important figure in Mithridates' life. However, there was no need for her to stay with him. He was old and she was young. Essentially, she disappeared into history. Or did she? We know that she did survive the crossing of the Caucasian mountains, as there was a statue commemorating her and honoring her as Mithridates' wife. But other than this, what happened to her is unknown. It's thought that she escaped in a boat to Sinope and then later wrote about Mithridates' life during the Civil War of Rome. This isn't impossible, and for all we know, it could have happened. But by 61 BC, Pompey celebrated his triumph. It was glorious. As Appian points out, no Roman general had ever vanquished an enemy as powerful as Mithridates and conquered so many nations, extending the Roman rule to the Euphrates and the Black Sea. There were 700 ships and countless wagon loads of barbarian armor, banners from 1,000 castles and 900 cities. All followed the triumph. 20,000 talents worth of gold, silver, vessels, and jewelry followed. To make a long story short, it had taken Pompey's secretaries 30 days to take an inventory of 2,000 onyx and gold chalices of Mithridates. A host of 324 captives came next, one of them being the son of Tigran the Great, also named Tigran, and his wife and daughters, Nisa. Mithridates' daughter that had never lost her baby teeth was behind them, along with his sisters and 5 sons: Artaphernes, Cyrus, Oxathres, Darius, Xerxes, and the princesses Eupatra and Orsabirus. Aristobulus, king of the Jews, followed, and then a troop of Amazonian warriors. Tigran and Aristobulus were strangled, and then a silver statue of Mithridates' grandfather Pharnaces I followed, along with a 10-foot statue of Mithridates made of gold. After all of this, the slave behind Pompey whispered a shivering sentence: "Remember, you are mortal." And so the death of Mithridates was like the destruction of 10,000 enemies in one fell swoop. But his legacy did not end. The name of Mithridates Eupator, Dionysus the Great, lived on for 2 millennia, inspiring literature, art, music, popular culture, and scientific investigations. For his art, Boccaccio and Christine de Pizan. Another one by Bartolomeo Pliny. Verhoeven created one of Mithridates' head busts. In terms of drama, Pagau created Monemy in 1600. B. Hort created one in 1604 called Hypsicrate. Nathaniel Lee made one called Mithridates, King of Pontus, a Tragedy, 1678. Here are some operas about Mithridates. Aldro Bandini, Mithridate in Sebastian, 1701. Scarlatti, Mithridate Eupator, 1707. Capallo, 1723. Vittorio Signa-Santi in Gasparini, 1767. Mozart's first serious opera, written at 14, was Mithridate Re di Ponto, 1770. Mithridates appeared in the video game Rome Total War in 2004. Mithridates was on the History Channel game Anachronism in 2008. Mithridates also appeared in the board game Spartacus, Crisis in Rome. It had been 40 years of fighting Rome. Mithridates may have lost 2 out of 3 wars, but in the end, look who gets celebrated as a hero. The Turkish Empire still celebrates about Mithridates. It was only until Mithridates' death that he was called a Hellenistic hero, from fighting barbarians to the world's strongest empire. And now we all have the answer to the long-awaited question of who was Mithridates and why did he harbor such great hatred towards the Romans. And as we can see, Pontus lasted from 281 to 63 BC, and each king and queen grew his/her landmass, with Mithridates the Great extending it to its greatest extent. And then Pharnaces would later attack Rome during their civil war, which I will cover in another episode. Tigran the Great died at 85, and Mithridates the Great died at 72. Thank you all for watching this episode. You can find me on Instagram at LoneBerserkerYT. You can find my website at www.theriseoftheeast.com. And you can buy my book on Amazon called Mithridates the Great, the Indomitable, and the Poison King, Rome's Deadliest Enemy. This has been the Rise of the East podcast, and I have been your host, Joel Francis.